opens the path for the queen and bishop, immediately staking a claim in the center and challenging black for control. Mirroring white's initial thrust immediately contests central space, setting the stage for an open game where piece activity will be paramount. Securing the central pawn while developing a knight opens up lines for kingside expansion and pressure. Protecting the central pawn while preparing development, this knight aims to control key squares. Ruy-Lopez-Initiation, immediately contesting black's knight and threatening a pin that could disrupt pawn structure. Challenging the bishop's presence, this move probes white's intentions and prepares for central expansion, potentially leading to a tense knight maneuver. Retreating the bishop preserves its influence, maintaining pressure along the long diagonal and preparing for central pawn advances. A natural development, challenging the central pawn and preparing castling, while strategically eyeing the d4 square. Securing the central pawn with d3 prepares kingside development and prevents immediate pawn tension on the center. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge white's pawn structure establishes a more robust pawn chain. Solidifying the pawn chain, white proactively secures the d3 square, preparing a potential kingside advance while subtly limiting black's central influence. This calm consolidation, rather than an immediate skirmish, aims to build a robust structure for the middle game. Initiating the fianchetto of the bishop on g6 prepares to deploy it to its long diagonal, aiming to control key central squares and potentially exert pressure on white's kingside down the h8-a1 diagonal. This maneuver simultaneously strengthens black's kingside pawn structure, creating a solid defensive setup. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, preventing any immediate bishop intrusion, and preparing for a potential kingside expansion or a regrouping of pieces. The dark-squared bishop now finds a powerful outpost on g7, aiming its gaze deep into white's queenside and preparing for potential castling. This natural development secures the king's safety and continues black's harmonious setup, anticipating further pawn advances or piece activity. It's a patient positioning, ready to contest the center or launch a kingside assault later. Positioning the bishop to f4 now eyes the kingside's weakened dark squares and prepares for potential kingside expansion, while also offering a retreat square should black's knights become too aggressive. Developing the bishop to guard the d-pawn solidifies black's structure, a necessary step before launching any central pawn breaks or knight maneuvers. Preparing for the kingside castling, this piece relocation simultaneously offers support for a future d4 advance, subtly improving the knight's placement while also defending the pawn on e4. Securely tucking the monarch away behind a pawn shield, black prioritizes king safety, a fundamental building block before contemplating further central operations or piece development in this Ruy-Lopez variation. Preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active central square, potentially the e3 or d2 positions, allows white to reinforce the kingside and potentially launch a kingside pawn storm later, while also keeping options open for a queenside pawn advance. Recentering the queen offers flexibility, preparing to support a central pawn push or potentially shift to the kingside if the opportunity arises, while also avoiding immediate tactical entanglements and maintaining a harmonious piece setup. Pivoting the bishop to b3 subtly repositions a key piece, preparing to contest the d5 square and potentially support a central pawn push later on. It also reinforces the knight's defense on f3 while maintaining a watchful eye on the queenside diagonals. Unfurling the bishop to e6 offers a vital defensive post, shoring up the knight on c6 and preparing for potential central pawn pushes, all while maintaining a watchful eye on the kingside. Gaining space on the queenside, white now aims to influence the center and create potential outposts, while black has solidified their structure and aims for a harmonious development. This repositioning of the knight from c6 to d7 is a strategic adjustment, preparing for a potential pawn push on the queenside or an eventual regrouping to the f6 square if the opportunity arises, while also offering protection to the e5 pawn. Launching an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside signals white's intent to break open lines and exploit black's potentially exposed monarch. However, This advance also opens up the diagonal for black's bishop and weakens the kingside pawn structure, so careful calculation is paramount. Challenging the center, this maneuver boldly places the knight on an outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially open lines towards their king. The knight's redeployment to g3 aims to reinforce the e4 pawn and prepare for an eventual kingside pawn storm, subtly shifting the focus of white's aggression. Solidifying the central pawn chain and challenging white's space grab, c5 aims to contest the d4 square and prevent white's knights from finding comfortable outposts, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the queen. Launching the rook to g1 signals an aggressive intention on the kingside, preparing to bolster the pawn storm and potentially pry open lines against black's castled king. Asserting control over the d4 square with the knight, black challenges white's center and prepares to potentially redeploy the knight to c2, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking opportunities on the queenside. Pushing the knight to f5 after its prior maneuver to g3 injects immediate tactical spice, challenging black's seemingly solid kingside structure and potentially opening lines for attack. A bold pawn thrust by white's king's flank is now met by black's queen repositioning to solidify central control, anticipating potential kingside pawn advances and preparing for a unified response. Initiating a peace trade, the knight aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially open lines, though it vacates the king's defense temporarily and invites a pawn advance that could compromise white's own king's safety. Accepting the pawn exchange on g7 significantly alters the pawn structure, creating a unique diagonal for white's queen and potentially a target on white's kingside, while black's king finds a safer haven than it might have expected on the second rank, though now it's somewhat confined. Initiating a knight's sortie to the kingside periphery, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially create attacking chances, though it momentarily neglects central control and allows black a freer hand in the pawn structure. Stepping back with the king to h8 is a prudent retreat, acknowledging the exposed position on g7 and seeking refuge from the pressure along the g-file and the newly opened diagonal for white's light-squared bishop. This maneuver aims to solidify the kingside defense, creating a safer haven and preparing for potential counterplay or a more balanced positional struggle. This exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure, immediately transforming the central tension into a more open game where the queenside pawns of black, particularly the b-pawn, become a prominent target. Black's recapture on d4 significantly alters the pawn structure, creating an isolated pawn for white on d3 while simultaneously opening the e-file and solidifying black's central presence. This exchange is a positional concession by white, sacrificing their central pawn majority for potential attacking chances, which black now has a better opportunity to parry by developing pieces towards the kingside. The king's safety remains paramount, and black's monarch, though still castled, finds itself somewhat exposed due to the weakened pawn shield. Unlocking the queen to potentially target black's vulnerable kingside pawn structure, while also preparing to contest the open d-file, signifies a shift towards more aggressive intentions. The queen vacates the e7 square, potentially preparing to redeploy to a more active diagonal or to defend key central pawns, while also avoiding any immediate threats from white's minor pieces. A daring gambit for initiative, qh6 injects immediate pressure, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive development and the exposed nature of the kingside. This aggressive maneuver seeks to disrupt white's harmony and create tactical opportunities by forcing a reaction from black's pieces, potentially leading to imbalances that can be leveraged for a later advantage. Emerging from the shadows of pins and threatened lines, the knight repositions to defend its flank and create an escape route, aiming to bolster the beleaguered pawn chain. Initiating kingside castling aims to bring the king to safety on the queenside, a common maneuver when the center is locked and the kingside is becoming a potential battlefield for the opponent. This redeployment also prepares for potential queenside pawn advances and frees the rook to join the fray along the central files or the now open c-file. By completing castling, white signals a shift in strategic focus, moving away from the pawn advances on the king side, which have now stalled, and towards a more flexible setup for the middle game. The rook on h1 is now connected to the queenside defense and can participate in offensive actions, while the king enjoys greater security behind a pawn shield. Black boldly injects dynamic counterplay on the queenside, aiming to unravel white's well-anchored central pawn chain and create threats against the castled king's sanctuary. A bold attempt to reignite the attack, though it walks a fine line, sacrificing a knight for what appears to be a fleeting tactical advantage rather than lasting positional gain. Sacrificing the bishop on f5 rips open lines and desperately seeks to disrupt white's attacking potential, though it leaves black's king somewhat exposed on the queenside. Opening the g-file creates immense pressure on black's kingside, potentially leading to a swift attack on the vulnerable monarch after the exchange on f5. Diving the rook deep into the enemy's territory aims to create attacking potential, though it leaves the king's immediate defenses slightly exposed to potential knight forays. Opening the c-file, white aims to exploit the newly created diagonal for the bishop and disrupt black's pawn structure. Opening the queenside for potential counterplay, this pawn push challenges white's central control and aims to disrupt the long-term stability of their pawn structure. Securing the bishop on the long diagonal, this development actively pressures black's weakened queenside pawn structure and prepares to exploit the open c-file should it arise. Black aims to activate the rook on the open c-file, eyeing the weakened pawns on the queenside and potentially preparing a central pawn push with f5 later. Opening that f-file now offers a direct assault on black's kingside defenses. Initiating a counterattack on the kingside, this maneuver desperately seeks to disrupt white's spatial advantage and unleash black's rooks. The rook's relocation to the g-file initiates a decisive sequence, exploiting the weakened kingside and opening the g-file for future operations against the now exposed black monarch. Opening the f-file for the rook now allows it to become an active participant, potentially swinging over to the kingside or controlling the central files. This tactical decision, while seemingly simple, completely reshapes the material balance and introduces a crucial dynamic element to the ensuing middle game. The rook's repositioning to the central file signals a shift toward exploiting the weakened kingside pawn structure and establishing immediate pressure. A courageous repositioning into the heart of white's territory, aiming to exploit the temporarily exposed g-file and potentially create a passed pawn. Securing the king's sanctuary initiates a crucial defensive maneuver. Challenging the queenside pawn structure unlocks immediate tactical possibilities, aiming to disrupt white's central dominance. Opening the diagonal for the queen and rook, this capture offers a chance to exploit the exposed black king by creating an immediate threat on the h-file, while also simplifying into a slightly more open position where pawn structure advantages could become more pronounced. A desperate attempt to unravel white's central structure, aiming to create counterplay along the now semi-open b-file and potentially exploit the weakened pawn chain after the exchange. Unleashing the pawn storm, white intends to pry open the queenside and exploit the now exposed black king, creating an immediate crisis on the dark squares. A bold knight repositioning, aiming to disrupt white's central control and perhaps create dynamic counterplay on the kingside. The knight's retreat to f7 might seem passive at first glance, but it serves a crucial purpose. It defends the g6 pawn, which is under immediate threat from white's open g-file, and simultaneously prepares to potentially jump to e5, challenging the established white pieces. This is a subtle but important tactical maneuver, as it forces white to reconsider their attacking plans. While white has a pawn majority in the center, black's active pieces, particularly the knight on e5, could become a serious problem if not addressed. The entire position hinges on whether black can successfully coordinate their forces to exploit the temporary weakness around white's king. Sacrificing the bishop here is a bold attempt to puncture black's suddenly robust pawn structure and unlock white's rooks for activity on the open c-file. It's a calculated risk, gambling that the resulting material imbalance will favor white once the dust settles, but it also grants black a significant advantage in central pawn control. The queen recaptures, re-establishing material equality but also locking down the f-file for a critical moment, effectively pausing white's immediate pawn-pushing ambitions on that flank and inviting a more positional struggle. Unlocking the f-file with aggressive intent, white aims to dismantle black's weakened queenside pawn structure and exploit the open lines leading towards the black king. This pawn thrust injects immediate dynamism into the position, forcing black to confront threats on multiple fronts and potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited in the ensuing complications. The rook's advance aims to exploit the open g-file, creating immediate threats against white's king and forcing a response to prevent a potential mating net or material loss. A determined push to widen the attacking front on the queen side, aiming to pry open lines for potential infiltration and exploit the pinned knight on e5. The position is ripe for a breakthrough, and this pawn thrust opens a vital diagonal for the remaining pieces while threatening to destabilize white's central pawn structure. Seizing the open file with decisive force, this pawn thrust decisively rips open the king's defenses, initiating a brutal assault on the weakened dark squares. A desperate gambit, sacrificing material for a final, albeit slim, chance at disrupting white's king's safety and creating some chaos on the board. Black is hoping to open lines or force a repetition, but the pawn structure is too compromised to believe in a true comeback. Seeking refuge from the encroaching storm of pawns and the unleashed rook, the monarch scrambles to a slightly less exposed square, hoping to weather the immediate tactical thunder. The rook's sacrifice creates a dynamic mating threat against the exposed white king, leveraging the now open diagonal for the queen and the pinned knight. The rook's capture opens the king's pawn structure, exposing the dark squares around the monarch and creating immediate attacking chances for white. Unleashing the queen's diagonal, black forces the king to the side, disrupting white's immediate checkmate threats and opening a pathway to potentially pick off weakened pawns. The king's flight from the pawn storm on the queen side has finally been halted, ushering in a decisive exchange that will irrevocably alter the course of the game. The black queen boldly enters the fray, seeking to exploit the exposed white king. Accepting the immediate check with the king steers the game toward a sharp, unforgiving endgame where precise calculation is paramount. Unleashing a final, desperate check from the queen, this desperate attempt aims to exploit the exposed white king and perhaps create a perpetual check scenario, though the white king's escape square on c2 and the presence of powerful white pieces suggest this might be a valiant but ultimately futile effort. The king's trek to b4 may seem like a tactical gamble, but it bravely ventures into a more open landscape, potentially seeking to escape the immediate pin while hoping to provide support down the central files. A desperate attempt to force a draw through perpetual check, exploiting the exposed royal position. Unleashing the king into this chaos is a bold gamble, banking on the pawn's advanced position to create a decisive checkmate or perpetual check. The king, now exposed and cornered on the light squares, faces relentless pressure as the queen swings in for another check, forcing a desperate repositioning.